The river was restless that night, whispering secrets to the wind as it cut through the silent town of Ashford. A thick fog curled around the old bridge, its weathered wood slick with the evening mist. Beneath it, the water swirled in slow, lazy spirals, an inky abyss that held a history of secrets best left undisturbed. It was here, under the cold glow of a flickering street lamp, that Lena Carter stood, cradling her newborn in trembling arms. Her breath hitched, her wide, tear-filled eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to inch closer, suffocating her. She swore she wasn't alone. The town would later whisper about what happened next. A mother, young, desperate, standing on the bridge's edge, her nightgown clinging to her frail body, her bare feet numb against the wooden planks. Then a soft sob. A final whisper. And the chilling splash of something small vanishing into the depths below. By the time the search party arrived, Lena was gone. No footprints leading away. No sign of a struggle. Just silence. And the river's patient, unyielding flow. Ashford was a town with a history, though most of its residents chose to forget. Tales of the river's curse were whispered only in hushed voices, spoken between swigs of whiskey in the dim corners of the local bar. They said the river had a hunger, one that demanded sacrifice. Lena's disappearance wasn't the first, nor would it be the last. Old Mrs. Wren, the town's self-proclaimed historian, had seen it happen before. She had been a young girl when another woman, pale and shaking, had stood on the same bridge one stormy night, clutching something close to her chest. The next morning, there was nothing left but damp footprints leading nowhere. The women who heard the whispers always disappeared. And their babies, if they had them, were never found. 2 weeks after Lena vanished, Daniel Grayson arrived in Ashford. A journalist from the city, hardened by years of covering crime stories, he wasn't the type to be scared off by local legends. His editor had sent him after news of Lena's disappearance started gaining traction online. The missing mother. The cursed river. A perfect horror story wrapped in mystery. Daniel was staying at the Holloway Inn, the only motel in town, a place that smelled of damp wood and forgotten memories. He spent his first day retracing Lena's last steps, gathering details from hesitant townsfolk, all of whom had the same warnings. You shouldn't go near the bridge after dark. There are things in that water we don't understand. She heard it, you know. The crying. They all hear it before they go. Daniel dismissed the rumors as superstition. The bridge was just a bridge. The river just a river. The key to the story was Lena herself. Why would a young mother, with no history of mental illness or abuse, suddenly throw her baby into the river? And where had she gone afterward? It didn't add up. That evening, Daniel found himself standing on the same bridge where Lena had last been seen. The fog was thicker here, the air unnaturally still. He pulled out his voice recorder and clicked it on. Friday, October 17th. Standing at Holloway Bridge. Locals claim this is where Lena Carter threw her baby into the river before disappearing. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. Just a mystery. He exhaled, watching his breath curl in the cold air. There was nothing eerie about the place. Just an old wooden bridge and a dark stretch of water beneath it. And yet, Daniel felt it. A shift in the air. A faint hum in his ears, like a distant lullaby. His fingers tightened around the recorder as a chill ran down his spine. He wasn't alone. Then, his heart pounded. He turned toward the river, scanning its surface. The water rippled outward, slow and deliberate, like something had just sunk beneath it. The recorder crackled with static. And then, "Help me." Daniel froze. The voice was faint, a whisper lost in the wind. A woman's voice. "Please, help me." His grip tightened around the recorder. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay rational. Sound traveled in strange ways over water. It could have been anything. And yet, as he looked into the river's inky depths, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was down there watching. Someone who had been waiting. Daniel returned to his motel that night, shaken but determined. He played back the recording, listening to the static-laced whispers. The voice was real. A woman's voice. But Lena was gone. Everyone knew that. Did they? At 2:13 a.m., he woke up to the sound of a baby crying. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But as he sat up, the sound grew louder. A desperate, helpless wail drifting in from outside his window. Daniel's skin crawled. He grabbed his recorder and slowly approached the window. The streets were empty. The night was still. But the crying? It was coming from the bridge. His breath came shallow as he gripped the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside. But he had come here for the truth. And the truth was calling for him. The wailing of the infant echoed through the empty streets, weaving through the cold night air like a ghostly lament. Daniel Grayson stood frozen at his motel room door, his pulse hammering in his ears. The crying was coming from the bridge. His breath hitched as he stepped outside. The town was still, bathed in the eerie glow of a flickering street lamp. He hesitated, gripping his recorder tightly, then forced himself forward. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but curiosity, and something deeper, something almost compelled, drove him on. The Holloway Bridge loomed ahead, its silhouette shrouded in mist. As he neared, the crying grew louder, desperate. Heartbreaking. The sound wasn't normal. It carried an unnatural weight, an emotion so raw it seemed to scrape against his very soul. Daniel reached the edge of the bridge, his breath fogging in the cold night air. The river below churned, black and endless, its surface disturbed by unseen ripples. Then abruptly, the crying stopped. The silence was suffocating. Daniel's hand trembled as he lifted his recorder and pressed the button. 2:45 a.m. Holloway Bridge. I heard the sound of a baby crying from this location. No sign of anyone. Possible hoax or... Daniel's blood ran cold. Something had moved in the water. He squinted into the darkness, but the fog was thick, twisting like living tendrils. A shadow flickered beneath the surface, just for a second, but long enough to send an icy chill down his spine. A whisper brushed against his ear, so soft he almost didn't catch it. She's still here. His breath hitched. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the fog. Nothing. But something was watching. Daniel didn't remember running back to his motel. He only remembered the oppressive silence that followed him, the way his skin prickled as if unseen eyes bore into his back. He locked the door behind him, his breath ragged. He fumbled for his laptop, fingers shaking as he pulled up the files he'd gathered on Lena Carter. The missing mother. The whispers. The river's curse. A news report from 40 years ago caught his eye. Local woman Margaret Holloway vanishes after reportedly throwing her child into Holloway River. Witnesses claim to have heard the baby crying long after the child was presumed drowned. Body never recovered. Daniel's stomach clenched. Holloway. The same name as the bridge. The same story. It had happened before. Again and again. He rubbed his temples. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe the town's isolation had bred paranoia, passing down ghost stories through generations. But the recording on his device, the whispers, the crying, those were real. And so was the thing in the water. A knock at the door startled him. Sure. Urgent. Daniel hesitated, then slowly opened it. An old woman stood there. Wrinkled skin, gray hair tangled around her face, eyes cloudy with something ancient. You heard it, didn't you? She rasped. Daniel stared. The baby's cry. His throat went dry. You need to leave this town before it takes you too. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Wren, one of Ashford's oldest residents. She didn't wait for an invitation, stepping into the room with an air of urgency. They always hear it before they disappear. Her voice was barely a whisper. First the crying, then the whispers, and then... Her gaze darkened. The river takes them. Daniel swallowed hard. Lena Carter, what happened to her? Mrs. Wren exhaled shakily, settling into the chair near the window. The town street lamp outside flickered violently, casting shadows across her weathered face. Lena heard the baby's cry 3 nights before she vanished. Just like the others. Others? Mrs. Wren nodded. You think this is the first time, boy? The river calls to mothers. It's always been that way. They hear their babies crying, even when they're safe in their cribs. And soon it doesn't stop. It follows them. In their homes. In their dreams. Until they can't take it anymore. Daniel felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. Then why did she disappear too? The old woman's lips trembled. Because once the baby is gone, the river wants more. It wants her. Silence. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the motel window. You should leave, she whispered again. Before it's too late. Daniel clenched his jaw. I can't. Mrs. Wren studied him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she shook her head. Then it's already started. That night, Daniel dreamed of water. He was standing on the bridge, staring down into the river's black depths. The surface was still, almost like glass. Then a ripple. A pale hand broke through the water. Slender. Delicate. A woman's hand. Daniel tried to move, but his body felt frozen. The hand reached higher. An arm. A shoulder. Wet hair clung to a face that wasn't human. Lena. Her eyes were hollow voids, her skin stretched too tightly over her bones. Her lips parted and from her throat came the sound of a baby's cry. Daniel jolted awake, gasping. His motel room was dark, silent. But the mirror on the wall was fogged over, as if someone had been standing right in front of it. And written in the condensation in long, spindly letters. Help me. Daniel couldn't leave now. Not after that. He spent the next morning researching every missing woman tied to the Holloway River. 34 cases. All of them mothers. All of them vanishing after hearing the cries. None of their bodies were ever found. But the strangest detail? The babies were never on record. No birth certificates. No hospital records. Like they never existed at all. That night, Daniel returned to the bridge. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a familiar, faint sobbing. The river rippled. Daniel exhaled. Lena, he called softly. Silence. Then from the darkness, help me. Daniel's pulse pounded. It was her voice. But it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from below. The river's black surface shifted. And then, something rose from the water. The river was no longer still. Daniel stood frozen at the edge of the bridge, his breath shallow, heart hammering against his ribs. The black surface below rippled unnaturally, a slow disturbance rolling outward. He knew he should run, that he should turn back, but the voice had been unmistakable. Lena. She was down there. Help me. The whisper drifted up again, barely audible above the rustling wind. And then it rose. A figure emerged from the depths, slow and deliberate. A woman. Her soaked nightgown clung to her frail frame, her dark hair plastered against her face. Her limbs moved with unnatural precision, as if the water were pulling her upward rather than her rising on her own. Daniel's throat clenched as the woman's pale, lifeless eyes met his. It was Lena. Or what was left of her. Daniel stumbled back, his pulse hammering. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet remained rooted to the bridge. Lena's lips parted. A choked sound gurgled from her throat, raw and wet, as if her lungs were still full of water. She took a slow step forward, her bare feet making no sound against the wooden planks. You came for me. Her voice was hollow, distant, like an echo traveling from someplace far away. Daniel forced himself to speak. Lena, what happened to you? Her head tilted slightly, water dripping from her chin. And then she smiled. Daniel's stomach clenched. Something was wrong. The air grew thick with moisture, a damp chill wrapping around him like unseen hands. The scent of the river filled his nostrils, rotting wood, damp earth, and something else. Something foul. Lena took another step closer. Daniel backed away. What did you do? Lena blinked slowly, her movements unnatural. The sound of water sloshed around her, but she wasn't wet anymore. She wasn't real. I didn't want to, she whispered. But it wouldn't let me go. Daniel swallowed hard. What wouldn't let you go? Lena's gaze flickered downward toward the river, and for the first time, fear filled her hollow eyes. It's still hungry. And then, suddenly, she lunged. Daniel barely had time to react. Cold, wet fingers latched onto his wrist, pulling. He staggered backward, the old wooden planks groaning beneath him. Let me show you. Lena's grip was impossibly strong, her fingers ice cold, her nails biting into his skin. She yanked, and Daniel's foot slipped on the damp wood. The river churned beneath him. Daniel gritted his teeth, twisting his body to break free. He drove his elbow into her shoulder. She stumbled, but she didn't let go. Her expression was no longer pleading. It was empty. A doll-like mask stretched over something far worse. Daniel gasped as a second hand shot out from the river. Then, plot. It wasn't Lena's. It was something else. Something waiting beneath the surface. Something ancient. Daniel wrenched his arm free at the last second, throwing himself backward onto the bridge. His vision blurred, chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. When he looked up, Lena was gone. Only the river remained. Daniel didn't sleep that night. Back in his motel room, he rewound the recording from the bridge over and over. Static crackled through his headphones. Then, it's still hungry. A whisper. Soft. Almost distant. But beneath it, something else. A second voice. It wasn't Lena's. It wasn't even human. It was low, wet, and guttural. A language he didn't understand. Daniel shuddered, rubbing his arms to shake the cold creeping over his skin. The river had taken Lena. But it hadn't taken her alone. The next morning, Daniel went back to Mrs. Wren. The old woman opened her door before he even knocked. I told you not to go back there. Daniel stepped inside, placing his recorder on the table. I saw her. Lena. Mrs. Wren's face paled. And she's not alone, Daniel pressed. What's in that water? Mrs. Wren's hands trembled as she poured a cup of tea, though she didn't drink it. You're too stubborn for your own good, she muttered. Daniel stayed silent. Finally she sighed. There was a time long ago when this town was different. Before the river claimed it. She set the teacup down with a soft clink. The old stories talk about a woman, a mother, who lost her child to the current. They say she went mad with grief, cursing the river itself. And in her rage she drowned herself, calling on something that should have never been awakened. Daniel's fingers tightened around the table's edge. Since then it takes, not just any woman, mothers. His pulse quickened. Why the babies? Mrs. Wren closed her eyes. Because that's what it was promised. Betrayed. But the river never stops wanting more. She exhaled, voice barely above a whisper. And once a mother gives her child to the water, she belongs to it too. That night, Daniel returned to the bridge one last time. He knew he shouldn't. Every rational thought screamed at him to leave this cursed town and never look back. But he needed to know the truth. The water was unnaturally still, as if waiting. Daniel stepped closer, gripping his recorder. He stared down into the river's depths, heart pounding. Then a ripple. A shape emerged. Not a body. Not Lena. A crib. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It floated toward him, rocking gently in the current. A small, delicate shape lay inside. Baby. Daniel's hands shook. His entire body screamed, "Don't touch it." But before he could move, the infant opened its eyes. And from its tiny lips came a sound that chilled Daniel's blood. Not a cry. Not a wail. But a whisper. Help me. The crib floated closer. Daniel's pulse pounded as he watched the tiny, fragile shape inside shift beneath the pale moonlight. The water lapped against the edges of the wooden crib, pushing it gently toward the riverbank. Then the baby opened its eyes. Daniel sucked in a sharp breath. The infant's gaze was wrong. Its eyes weren't the soft, sleepy blue of a newborn, they were black. Deep, endless pools of darkness, like the bottom of the river itself. They swallowed the moonlight, reflecting nothing back. And then it spoke. Help me. Daniel's blood turned to ice. It was the same whisper he'd heard before, the same haunting plea that had followed him since he arrived in Ashford. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. But the baby. It was waiting for him. The wind howled through the trees. The river churned. And something moved beneath the surface. Daniel took a step back. His gut screamed at him to run. But before he could turn, the crib sank. The baby didn't cry. It didn't struggle. It simply vanished beneath the water. And from below, a hand shot up. Daniel barely had time to react. The pale, skeletal fingers wrapped around his ankle and yanked, hard. He hit the ground with a dull thud, his breath leaving his lungs in a rush. Dirt and dead leaves clung to his skin as he scrambled backward, heart hammering against his ribs. The hand was still there. Pale. Thin. Rotting. It clawed its way out of the river, dragging something horrific with it. Daniel's stomach twisted as a figure emerged from the water. It was a woman. Or at least it had been. Her flesh hung loosely from her bones, waterlogged and torn. Her hair was thick with river sludge, coiling like black veins around her skull. Her dress, a soaked nightgown, clung to her frail frame. Her mouth hung open as if frozen in a silent scream. And her eyes, black, bottomless voids, locked onto Daniel with a hunger that sent his soul shriveling in fear. It was Lena. Or whatever was left of her. Daniel's vision blurred with panic. He kicked at the hand, desperate to break free. The grip tightened. Lena's head tilted. Her lips curled into something that was almost a smile. Then she spoke. It's your turn now. Daniel screamed as she pulled him toward the water. His body hit the river like a slab of concrete. The cold was instant. Paralyzing. Daniel thrashed, kicking against the unseen force pulling him deeper. His lungs burned. He clawed at the water, fighting toward the surface, but the hands were everywhere. Clutching. Twisting. Pulling him down. Shapes flickered in the dark. Faces, twisted, hollow-eyed mothers, their mouths forever frozen in agony. He opened his mouth to scream, and something slid inside. The taste of rot and decay flooded his tongue. Daniel choked, kicking harder, his body screaming for oxygen. Then, light. His head broke the surface. He gasped, coughing up black water, his body convulsing with the desperate need for air. The river was eerily calm again. He thrashed toward the shore, dragging himself onto the muddy bank. His limbs were weak. His chest ached. but he was alive. Barely. Daniel lay there, shivering, staring up at the night sky. His thoughts were a storm. Lena. The baby. The voices. The thing in the water. Was all real. His fingers twitched. His arms felt heavy. Like something had left a weight inside them. Slowly he lifted his sleeve. His breath caught in his throat. Blackened veins twisted up his forearm, branching like roots. His pulse pounded beneath them, sluggish and thick. The river had marked him. And he knew deep in his bones. It wasn't finished with him yet. Daniel stumbled back to town before sunrise. His body felt wrong. His skin itched. His breath came in ragged gasps as if something inside him was changing. He needed answers. Mrs. Wren answered the door on the first knock. Her eyes widened. She knew. You touched the water, she whispered. Daniel barely managed a nod before his knees buckled. Mrs. Wren caught him. Pulled him inside. Her fingers grazed his arm. Her face darkened when she felt the black veins beneath his skin. It's in you now, she murmured. Daniel swallowed hard. He knew. How do I stop it? Mrs. Wren exhaled, guiding him to a chair. She poured him a drink, but her hands trembled. You don't. Silence. Daniel stared. What do you mean? There has to be a way. Lena. Lena is gone, Mrs. Wren cut in. Her voice was sharp. They all are. Daniel's head swam. The black veins throbbed beneath his skin. Then why am I still here? Mrs. Wren hesitated. She looked at him like he wasn't human anymore. Because the river wants something else from you. Daniel's blood ran cold. What does it want? Mrs. Wren's lips pressed into a thin line. It doesn't want you to drown. She met his gaze, her next words dropping like stones in his gut. It wants you to bring it more. Mrs. Wren finally spoke, her voice brittle. It's been this way for generations. The river doesn't just take, it trades. Mothers give their children and in return they become part of it. Daniel swallowed. Then why didn't it take me? Mrs. Wren's face darkened. Because it needs someone to continue the cycle. To find more. Daniel's stomach churned. You're saying it wants me to feed it? Mrs. Wren nodded. It marked you, Daniel. You can feel it, can't you? The pull? He could. Even now, the river whispered in his mind. Murmuring. Calling. It coiled around his thoughts like a leech, urging him to obey. To bring more. To take. His pulse hammered. How do I stop it? Mrs. Wren hesitated. Then she whispered something that sent ice through his veins. You can't. That night, Daniel felt it inside him. The hunger. The whispers. When he closed his eyes, he saw the river. Black and endless, pulsing like a living thing. The faces of the drowned drifted beneath the surface, waiting. His hands itched. His veins throbbed. He wasn't just marked. He was becoming something else. The hunger worsened. Daniel left the motel at midnight, his body moving on its own. His feet carried him toward the river, his mind foggy, his hands trembling. He needed to give it something. Someone. Then he saw her. A young woman, no more than 20, standing alone by the bridge, staring at the water. Her shoulders shook as she wiped her tears. She was crying. A mother. Daniel's heart pounded. She doesn't deserve this. But the river coiled around his thoughts, whispering, urging, commanding. One more. His hands curled into fists. Just one more. And then the woman took a step closer to the edge. Daniel gasped. She was going to jump. She was about to give herself willingly. And suddenly the hunger inside him roared. Daniel grabbed her arm. She gasped, whirling around, eyes wide with fear. Don't, he rasped. You don't have to do this. Her breath hitched. You don't understand, she choked. It took my baby. I don't want to, I can't. Her sobs racked her body. Daniel's own hands trembled. This was what the river wanted. It didn't need him to kill. It needed him to let them go. To stand aside. To let them feed it. His pulse pounded. He could do it. He could walk away, let the hunger inside him fade, let her give herself to the water. It would be so easy. So easy. But then he saw Lena. Standing in the shallows, her hollow eyes watching. A silent warning. And suddenly, Daniel made his choice. No. The river screamed inside his head as he yanked the woman back. She gasped, stumbling away from the edge. Her wide, tear-streaked face stared at him in shock. Go, Daniel urged, voice tight. Now. For a moment she didn't move. Then trembling she ran. The river howled. A cold, furious force ripped through him, slamming into his chest, his skull, his veins. His body spasmed, his vision blurring with darkness. And then, hands burst from the water. Pale, skeletal, clawing. Lena. The mothers. The drowned. They dragged him under. The cold was instant. Daniel hit the water hard, sinking fast. His limbs went numb, his lungs burning, his vision fading to black. And then, he stopped sinking. The hands released him. The river let go. Daniel's body floated. The hunger inside him faded. The black veins vanished. The river had lost its hold on him. And in the depths, through the shifting water, he saw them. Lena. The drowned. They were smiling. Because the cycle was broken. Daniel kicked toward the surface. And for the first time in decades, the river stayed silent.